Many Christians dream of stepping foot in the places where Jesus walked and taught, of seeing the land of the Bible come to life before their eyes. For centuries, Christians have taken pilgrimages to the Holy Land, the historic land of Palestine, to see the stories of their faith take shape in stone structures and lush desert valleys. The Christian tradition shares this region as a religious birthplace with Judaism, and with Islam as a place of divine revelation. And yet, Christians have maintained a unique relationship with the land of the Bible and its holy sites since the 4th century CE. Trips to the Holy Land are ubiquitous for maze-filled walks through the vibrant old city of Jerusalem, boat rides on the Sea of Galilee, followed by a meal of St. Peter's fish, reading passages of scripture from hilltops and olive groves, and visiting the holy city of Jesus' birth, from Shepherd's Field to Manger. Yet, between the lines of this Bible-colored view, there are the stark realities of those who live in the land, those whose stories often remain unheard by tour groups and religious pilgrims. Tourism in the Holy Land stops short of telling the whole story of the land, from biblical times to today. And the question begs, what lies in between, or perhaps right under our noses? What happens when Holy Land tours go beyond checkpoints and separation walls and leave no living stone unturned? Welcome to episode 5 of the Touring the Holy Land series, an exclusive series with Across the Divide podcast. I am your co-host Jen here. In this episode, I talk with Sara Williams about Christian solidarity tours with Palestinians. Sara shares about her own story of her first trip to the Holy Land, which was a thoroughly dispensationalist trip. She talks about her spiritual and theological upbringing, and then how that shifted over the years, and then talks about her research with Christian groups that go to Palestine, to the Holy Land, in a model that she calls the Come and See tours, with groups that aim to center the experiences of Palestinian Christians, aim to uplift their voices and to build relationships with them. So Sara shares a lot of really, really awesome insights from that research of what she sees, what kinds of experiences happen when Palestinian stories and experiences are centered in tourism. And she also just talks about, she kind of exposes the ways that a competition for narrative and history is present in your average Christian tour to the Holy Land, and the ways that belonging is a part of that, the ways that we see who lives in the land and whose stories are valid and authentic based on the kinds of stories that we hear on trips. So you won't be disappointed by this episode. I really, really enjoyed this conversation a lot and feel like I'm thinking about so much after talking with Sara. And so I hope that that's your experience too. You might notice a fun appearance in this episode is that you get a sneak peek of some exclusive Across the Divide merch that will be available coming your way soon. So I just wanted to point that out, that's present in this episode, which is really fun and exciting. You will be able to catch a wind of this news soon on social media, Across the Divide on Instagram and Facebook, and on our Patreon page. In my extended conversation with Sara, we talk about kind of her observations of what kinds of transformative experiences Christians have had on these kinds of tours in their encounters with Palestinian Christians. And that's really awesome. If you don't support us yet, please consider doing so. You can check us out on patreon.com/acrossthedivide. Our supporters get all kinds of exclusive perks, including the bonus conversation from each episode we record. So check that out there. Without further ado, I'll introduce you to Sara. Sara A. Williams is an assistant professor of religious studies at Fairfield University, Her scholarship examines possibilities for just relationships in contexts marked by asymmetries of power and privilege. Her research on this topic has spanned progressive American Christian Holy Land tourism and gentrifying post-industrial U.S. urban communities. Dr. Williams holds a PhD from Emory University, an MA in religion from Yale Divinity School, and a Master of Social Work from the University of Georgia. Friends, enjoy my conversation with Sara Williams. Hey, Sara, welcome. It's so good to have you on the podcast.
Thanks. I'm really glad to be on. Thank you for the invitation.
Yeah, I think I'm really excited to learn a little bit more about your experience today, and then also your research and especially your field research in Palestine and Israel. So I'm wondering if, to start out, you can just share a little bit more about your story and tell us how you came to study religious tourism and American Christian relations to Palestine and Israel.
Yeah. For that, we have to go back to my time in college. So I was raised, well, and even a little bit before that, I was raised what I call Catholic Jellicle, which is a word I made up.
I love that. I know exactly what you mean before you're going to start, but please tell us.
Yeah. I sort of existed. I was born in 1983, and so I kind of came of age in this like Venn diagram that the moral majority had created between Catholics and evangelicals, really around reproduction and abortion, but it sort of trickled into other kinds of matters. And so, I grew up, my very Catholic mother, took me to a Billy Graham crusade. We had Pat Robertson's 700 Club on in the house every day. My parents were donors. The kind of dispensationalist theology, even though it wasn't the theology being reflected in the Catholic Church that I went to, was kind of in the water for me. And I went to a youth group in high school that was in a conservative Baptist church because a friend of mine down the street went to the church. And it's there that I was exposed to lots of different sort of conservative evangelical ideas, one of those being dispensationalism. And kind of ended up sort of in that space, and which brought me to Moody Bible Institute for college.
Okay.
And if you know anything about Moody Bible Institute, you know that it is sort of a bastion for dispensationalist theology. I was never like sort of a hardcore dispensationalist. To me, it was sort of like part of the package that I had theologically bought into at the time. I mean, that sounds a little crass putting it that way, but because it was very genuine for me at the time, I was really theologically searching. But I felt like that kind of theology came with this package that I, this package theological deal that I kind of needed to accept if I was going to have a personal relationship with Christ and go to heaven. Mm-hmm. So my senior year at Moody, I ended up going on a Holy Land tour that was led by Michael Rydelnik, who's, kind of a very popular dispensationalist writer, at least in sort of dispensationalist academic circles. And also Mike Van Lanningham. So, went to, kind of saw where Jesus was going to return in the old city, right? Saw Megiddo. I got the tour with that whole dispensationalist gloss onto it. So this was always sort of in the back of my mind. But again, I wasn't like waving the dispensationalist flag in terms of how I lived out my faith. It was just sort of part of this like package that I had accepted.
I feel like a lot of our listeners are going to relate to your story a lot. And this language of dispensationalism should be very familiar to us given the series we just did on Christian Zionism. But if I'm hearing you right, to like buy into or accept this dispensationalist theology, it sounds like it was just part of your understanding of what it looked like to be a Christian, right? And I also heard you say like salvation and to be saved. So it wasn't really something to like consider like, oh, is this what I believe or not? But it's just kind of like, oh yeah, this is part of the picture.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's
Okay.
exactly right. I think what a lot of folks who have never been part of kind of evangelical, the part of the evangelical movement where dispensationalist is the most influential, people who have never been part of that world, I think of dispensationalism as something that you sort of really gung-ho sign on to and are very conscious of. And I think for most people who are influenced by dispensationalist theologies, it simply like trickles through in sermons, in religious cultures that they're a part of. And so it's not something that they're putting a stake in. It's just part of the package of religious life, that they have come to accept. For me, it might have been a little bit more explicit. I think probably many people who are influenced by dispensationalist theology could not even tell you what dispensationalism is, because it sort of just comes through in the water. Yeah. For me, it was a little different because I went to Moody, and so I was very aware of what dispensationalism was, because I had to write papers in my systematic theology class that were basically stating my own assent to particularly premillennial dispensationalist theologies.
Yeah. Okay.
There wasn't a lot of room for dissent there. So anyway, kind of going back to how I moved out of that space, I was not a Bible major at Moody. I was a counseling major, which is a program that's gone through several iterations. I think they now call it human services, but it essentially was an applied psychology program. It was meant to prepare you to go on to get a master's in counseling or a master's in social work. And that is what I thought I wanted to do at the time. Mostly because I had sort of this natural kind of empathy and felt solidarity with marginalized people, although I didn't have that language at the time to express it that way. And I was being told that if you're a woman and that's sort of the giftings that you have, then you need to go into counseling. And so I became a bachelor's level social worker coming out of Moody. I worked for an organization affiliated with the Methodist Church called Child Serve. I had a caseload of women with children prenatal to 3, and I was trained on a child development curriculum, and I did home visits with them, and kind of shared information on healthy ways to interact with your child for their development, which I think is kind of hilarious because I was this 22-year-old white girl doing this to a caseload of women who are mostly immigrants and people of color. So I was so green and didn't know anything, but I think I got more out of that experience than I'm sure. I think the most the women probably got out of it was the referrals I was able to get them for material, things that they needed. So it really exposed me to systemic injustice. Another thing that exposed me is just living at Moody at the time. You were, so this was in the early 2000s. You were a few blocks on one side from the Gold Coast of Chicago and a few blocks on the other side from Cabrini Green, which at the time was, at its sort of infamous peak. And so, there were all of these signs of racial inequities and economic inequities around me, and I just didn't have the theological or political language for it at the time, or sociological language even. And so I ended up, after this experience as a social worker, a bachelor's level social worker, going into an MSW program. And that's really where I started to get the kind of sociological and political language. And became much more, progressive in those areas. And I felt like my theology just couldn't keep up. At one point, I, kind of asked myself, can I be a Christian and, kind of hold these kinds of positions in terms of, structural injustice related to marginalized people? And I know every liberation theologian right now is like screaming into the void that I would even ask that question. Right. But it just wasn't in my theological landscape. So I was really struggling. I was also married at the time to someone I'd gone to Moody with who was not on the same kind of journey that I was on, and pastored at a church. And so I had a really hard time attending. It was an evangelical megachurch, attending the church. I remember going off and attending various churches on my own, trying to sort of sort all this out. And it was at that time that somebody handed me Tony Campolo's Letters to a Young Evangelical that had just come out.
Yeah.
And I devoured it in an afternoon. And I was like, oh my gosh, this is everything. I emailed Tony, I said, you've sort of changed my life, might be a little bit strong, but but really it kind of did. It set me on this journey that eventually led me to Sojourners and Jim Wallace. And at the same time, at a church that I was sort of trying out that was on sort of the more progressive cusp of evangelicalism, there was a PCUSA church that was on the more conservative end of PCUSA, but on the more, had brought in a speaker about Palestinian Christians. And I honestly can't remember who the speaker was at the time, but it really awakened me to thinking about the Palestinian Christian plight and that there's a population of Palestinian Christians in relationship to this dispensationalist theology that I had in my background. So fast forward a few years later, I found myself first interning in my MSW program and then working at the Carter Center in Atlanta, Georgia. And I had a colleague there, Sam Jones, who some of the listeners may know. He was quite involved in Palestinian solidarity movements. And he really brought to my attention Naima Teague's work in particular, and the work of Sabeel. And, I really just found myself going down the rabbit hole because of this dispensationalist past. And because I was sort of now my politics had become much more progressive, I was much more awakened to structural injustice. This just sort of made sense to me. So I, became acquainted with the work of Sabeel, with Palestinian liberation theology, and found myself a few years later at Yale Divinity School, where I received a fellowship to go study at Hebrew University in Jerusalem for a summer. And ostensibly it was for the kinds of things that you study, but maybe not from the same perspective, kind of looking at the biblical text and related sort of, archaeological sites and things. But I remember saying to one of the faculty at Yale, I'm doing this because I really want to get over there and know more about the work of Sabeel, because I had a hunch that I kind of wanted to write about that in some way for in my doctoral dissertation, because at that point I kind of knew I wanted to go on to doctoral work in theology and ethics. And he kind of said to me, well, just go for this program, but just use all your free time to like hang out at Sabeel and, kind of explore on your own. And so that's what I did. I just sort of like hung out with Omar at Sabeel. And I kind of joined, there are sort of day tours that come in and out of the Sabeel office. Cedar Duebus, kind of speaks about her story a lot. So I would just kind of, hang out there, sort of glob onto a tour for an afternoon. Doing that really acquainted me to this element of, I know this wouldn't be the word that Sabeel would use, but this element of tourism that is being used, I started to realize as kind of a materialization of Palestinian liberation theology, which at least in terms of the Palestinian liberation theology that those of us in the in the U.S. are most familiar with, Naima Teague's work, Mitri Rahab's work, has been really Western facing. And so these tours seem to be kind of operationalizing the goods of Palestinian liberation theology in the same kind of Western facing way. And that got me really interested about kind of the mix between tourism, which, has all kinds of colonial Orientalist baggage that comes along with it, and Palestinian liberation theology, which has very sort of ideal ethical goods associated with it. Like, what happens when you put those two things together? So that's how I kind of came to what was my dissertation and is now my book project. That was a long answer to your question.
No, thank you for sharing. And I have to say, I didn't know your story before now. And so I think, one, I'm so grateful for your journey and you sharing it with us, because I really do think that it's going to resonate with a lot of our listeners. And then, I think what's so interesting, you kind of talking about the pieces that were harder and harder to fit together between kind of shifting worldviews, understanding of kind of systemic injustice and marginalization, and struggling to put that together with different pieces of your kind of theological foundation. It sounds almost like Palestinian liberation theology was an entryway for you, maybe even before like Latin American or Black liberation theology. Is that right?
Yeah, so I was not acquainted with other liberation theology movements when I was first exposed to Palestinian liberation theology. And it wasn't until I was at Yale, and I had actually spent 3 semesters at Boston University School of Theology before that, that I was awakened to this broader world of Latin American, Black, womanist, all other kinds of liberation theologies.
If you think the work we're doing here at Across the Divide is important, and the conversations we're having are necessary, then I invite you to consider becoming a patron of the podcast, a monthly supporter of Across the Divide on patreon.com/Across the Divide. You can support us for as little as $5 a month and get access to various kinds of premium content like extended episode conversations, merch options, and the ability to have conversations with us and other Patreon supporters. You could also join us at frequent private meetings where we discuss previous episodes and plan for future conversations together on the podcast. So join the small and beautiful community of Across the Divide by signing up on patreon.com/Across the Divide.
For our listeners, like the work of Naima Atik, who really kind of foregrounded the Palestinian liberation theology movement, in 1980s, 1990s, and that's where Sabeel is born, as center in East Jerusalem for Palestinian liberation theology. What you mentioned, Sarah, is really interesting, of some of the ways we've gotten into this just briefly in past episodes, but the ways that Palestinian theology is really geared towards a Western audience out of this orientation of what many call like the Palestinian cry for justice, or this cry for the Western Christian church to hear and to recognize and validate the plight of the Palestinian people, and particularly Palestinian Christians. So the fact that immediately that kind of came directly into conversation with this Western, primarily colonial industry of tourism in the Holy Land is really fascinating. And we've talked at length in this series already about some of those colonial kind of groundings of tourism. But so I think you putting these into direct conversation is really fascinating. And so I'm wondering if you can just help us understand, before we get into like some of this work of solidarity tourism and what you're describing about the intersections of Palestinian liberation theology and tourism that doesn't quite look like other tourism that you had seen and experienced firsthand yourself when you were younger. I'm wondering if you can just help us understand a little bit first, like what kinds of orientations and practices are dominant in those kinds of maybe popular American Christian tourism, which, I think your experience shows and we've kind of seen elsewhere is often infused with Christian Zionism, if not very explicitly, kind of Christian Zionist tours with those kinds of objectives. So before we get into like what the alternative is, what are some of those things that you've seen and observed that are kind of those practices, those narratives that are really woven into just your average Holy Land trip or your average, kind of Christian Zionist trip?
Right. Yeah. Well, I think, Holy Land travel, at least in terms of, kind of Western facing Holy Land travel for Christians, exists on a kind of spectrum. So you get at the far, I guess, right end of the spectrum, the kind of tour that I went on with Moody, that's very explicitly dispensationalist and draws very, it very intentionally draws people that are going to, kind of identify with that narrative, and want more education in relationship to it.
Sure, sure.
Now, I, didn't go on a tour. So the tour I went on with Moody was much more about going to the holy sites and then sort of narrating them through a dispensationalist lens. There are also dispensationalist tours that are much more sort of political, like the kinds of things that ICEJ does. And that's not the kind of tour that I went on. But I think those exist at sort of the farthest right end of the spectrum. But that's not the majority of Holy Land tourism. I mean,
Sure.
the majority of Holy Land tourism, and here I'm going to plug Hilary Cale's book, Walking Where Jesus Walked, if your listeners are interested in kind of learning more about what is sort of the average Holy Land. She uses the language of pilgrimage, which many of her, it's an ethnographic book, many of her research subjects would also use. What is the sort of average, kind of pilgrimage tour that people go on? It really, first of all, they tend to be big package tours that are controlled by the Israeli tourism sector. And so because they're controlled by the Israeli tourism sector, they're going to have pro-Israel kinds of themes that are, kind of undergirded by the kinds of things you work on, by archaeological projects like the City of David. So if you go there's a Palestinian village called Silwan in East Jerusalem. If you went on your average Holy Land pilgrimage, you would not be going to Silwan. You would be going to the City of David. And this is really very much a theme in Holy Land tourism, is that there can be the same geographical space that are two or more different places at the same time. Everything is sort of palimpsestic in that way. And so you would go to that same geographical space and you would see that there's sort of a village around this archaeological dig site that you're going to, but nobody would ever mention it or acknowledge it. And so it would essentially, unless you were a very critical, keen observer, you wouldn't think to ask about it. And so the city of Silwan is essentially erased in most Holy Land, your typical Holy Land pilgrimage tour. And instead it becomes the City of David, which then undergirds, particular readings of the Bible that connect ancient Israel with the modern state of Israel, which then give people a particular kind of meaning to go home with. And that's very intentional. It's a very intentional move by the state of Israel and its Ministry of Tourism. That's just one example. There are many examples like that.
No, that's so helpful, Sarah, because listeners, if you remember a couple episodes ago in the series, we talked with Rafi Greenberg, who's an Israeli archaeologist who did extensive excavation in the City of David prior to the 2000s. And he talked about that of the village of Sawan, Palestinian village of East Jerusalem, which is essentially erased by this sort of biblical archaeological construction that transports a biblical past into the present. And that when he gave this advice to listeners of if you travel, be vigilant, be that keen observer, right? Because there's so much that won't be kind of shared or introduced to you that you will miss if you just kind of hear the narrative that's told to you. So I love that way that you talked about, Sarah, there being multiple places in the same place, and it depends on the story that's told or the language that's used. And so that also reminds me just of the kinds of narratives and executive orders that are being put forth in the United States by Mike Huckabee and others, that all of the West Bank or all of the occupied Palestinian territory should be referred to as Judea and Samaria instead of right, acknowledging that this is Palestinian territory and what happens when, a sort of ancient or biblical place name is used directly, kind of in lieu of or erasing a contemporary one.
Absolutely. There's so much power in naming, so much power in naming places and to define in people's imagination what those places are and should be.
I'm wondering if there's anything else that you want to highlight that you've observed in terms of what's a part of the kind of average American Christian kind of pilgrimage or tour, or maybe what isn't a part of them that you've since noticed?
That's a really great question. So there's an observation that I make in my book project that many, I haven't done an extensive catalog, so I can't say most maybe, but many average Holy Land pilgrimage tours go to a couple of sites that are not part of, that are not holy sites in the Christian tradition. And that is the Israel Museum and Yad Vashem. That really, so you can see there, again, the Israeli Ministry of Tourism pushing those kinds of sites, even though if you're thinking, I want to go on a pilgrimage to see where, to walk where Jesus walked, those would not necessarily fit into that as part of the project of Israeli placemaking. Now, what's interesting is on the tours that I researched, which I know we'll talk about in a minute, they only 2 of the 6 tours that I ethnographically researched went to Yad Vashem. None went to the Israel Museum, but instead they all went to Hebron, and they all went to a place called the Tent of Nations, which is a Palestinian Christian family farm that's been under threat for decades of confiscation by the Israeli government, and they've set up kind of an international peace ministry, for lack of a better term, there. Those 2 places would never show up on your kind of traditional Holy Land pilgrimage itinerary. Hebron would be narrated as way too dangerous to go to, and the Tent of Nations just wouldn't even be on the radar. And I think that really illustrates the difference in placemaking between sort of your typical Holy Land pilgrimage and the kinds of tours that I looked at, is that your typical Holy Land pilgrimage and the kind of tours I looked at, they all pretty much, go to the same kinds of, kind of major holy sites, right? Like there's always a day built in the kind of tours or a couple days that the kind of tours I looked at that, we went to the church in the Nativity, and, we went to the Holy Sepulchre, and, those will be on your average pilgrimage as well. But the sort of kind of Israeli nationalist sites, are mixed in your average pilgrimage in a way that they're not in the kind of tours that I studied.
Okay. And is this what you mean by placemaking? That like the choice in the kinds of places that are visited actually works to establish like a sort of reality or understanding of like what this place is, as in a biblical and a modern Israel? Or
yes.
Okay.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay.
So if you're visiting the city of David, and then immediately you go to the Israel Museum, and then you go to Yad Vashem, you are being guided on a narrative journey to, kind of look at the ancient connections to ancient Israel. And then, that's kind of solidified by all of the things that are displayed in the Israel Museum, right, which kind of highlight these kind of ancient archaeological findings that tie together ancient Israel with modern Israel. And then you go to Yad Vashem, which sort of undergirds this, the establishment of the state of Israel through a kind of post-Holocaust narrative. Mm-hmm. And you're going to come out with a particular understanding of what Israel is as a place and what it should be as a place and who belongs there and who doesn't belong there. As opposed to if you're going to Hebron and you're going to Tent of Nations, you're going to get a very different understanding of what that geographical area is as a place and who belongs, who doesn't belong, or not necessarily who doesn't belong, but who belongs and who is being told that they don't belong.
Yeah, I'm so grateful that you mentioned belonging, because that gets at that this is what's at stake is more than just how the history or contemporary reality of a place that the Christian faith is rooted. It's about more than just the place, but then becomes a question of who belongs here, right? And who's excluded from that narrative. And as you said that, I could think of so many moments in my own journey, which parallels yours in some ways, but where the narratives that I had learned about what Israel was and how that was connected to my understanding of biblical history. And then when I began to listen to and interact with Palestinians, I was like, oh, what you're telling me doesn't really fit into this narrative in any way. And so I'm kind of struggling with that. I'm struggling with what to make of it. I'm struggling with like how to understand how believable it is because of this other narrative that I know and believe. And then 3, I'm kind of inclined to think that like your stories is somewhat aggressive. Like it's kind of counter to this other one. It's trying to combat it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And so that question of belonging, I think is so important.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. And I think the idea that they're combating narratives is a really good way to put it. That I think the sort of framework that the state of Israel has set up in terms of, how much power they have to narrate the place has kind of forced Palestinians and Palestinian Christians to be in a position where they kind of can only speak in a combative way back to that. And I don't mean combative in a violent way. I just mean that there's, there's no option but to contest, right? There's, as I've been doing my work, I'm constantly reminded of Gertrude Spivak's observation that the subaltern cannot speak. Palestinian Christians and Palestinians, at large, have been put in a position where they can only speak on another's terms, whether it's Israeli terms or Western terms. There's little space for Palestinians to express themselves, at least to Western audiences, on their own terms.
Yeah. Okay. And I think, maybe my use of combative, like, is the connotation of that, right, is a little bit different, but I think contesting, I think that's a helpful way to look at, right? They can only contest and through these different kind of lenses and terminologies that would be palatable to a Western Christian audience.
Right.
Or to an Israeli one for that matter.
Right.
Okay, so maybe we can get into it now. You've been researching and are working on this incredible book about Palestinian solidarity tourism and what you've seen from Christian groups in that regard. Tell us about it. What is solidarity tourism, and why are American Christians beginning to engage in it, or maybe engaging in it more than they have historically?
Yeah. So it's a big question. So I'm trying to think of what angle to kind of come in at it. So there's sort of a scope of Palestinian led tours that I think American Christians take. One doesn't look all that different from a traditional Holy Land pilgrimage. There are Palestinians who, have either are citizens of Israel or are Jerusalemites, or who have gotten sort of one of the coveted, licenses to be able to guide in Israel. Those are few and far between. If you're a Palestinian who is in the West Bank, who very understandably just want to make a living and want to, kind of do that in a way that's going to attract, as many, Western pilgrims as they can. And so those tours, those Palestinian-led tours, might not look all that different from, your typical, Israeli-led pilgrimage tour. Then I think you have dual narrative tours, which are, tours that are really kind of oriented on a kind of just peace and reconciliation, and really grounded in the idea that I don't want to use both sides terminology, but that sort of multiple experiences deserve airtime. Now, the kind of tours that I looked at, and I don't exactly call them solidarity tours, except I do in an article that I wrote with my colleague Roger Bauman, whose work I'll plug too. He's wonderful. He writes on the Black Church and touring in Israel and Palestine. And that was in the Journal of the American Academy of Religion. And we used the term Palestinian Christian solidarity tours, I think we called them, partly because he used language for his tours. I use language for mine. We were trying to find something that kind of fit in between. But in terms of my own work, I call the kinds of tours that I look at come and see tours.
Good.
I use that I use that moniker. That is actually Palestinian language, although you're not going to ever find like some kind of website that has already sort of created a typological, this is what come and see tours are. I draw that from common language across a number of tours that have similar characteristics. And the defining characteristic in terms of the similar characteristics are that the impetus for people to come is to come and see the Palestinian Christians of the Holy Land in order to go and tell of it at home. And that go and tell is both a literal go and tell of come see the plight of Palestinian Christians and share it in sermons, share it in, talks with your church, share it in op-eds, whatever. But it's also, I think, a little bit more implicitly, although Daoud Nasser at Attentive Nations always makes this a little bit more implicit. It's also an invitation to be sort of transformed in a way that'll make you more attuned to injustice wherever you are. So go home and become conscientized to, see who the marginalized are in your midst, in your community. And so that's why I call them come and see tours. And the way I write about these tours, they really are an inverse of short-term missions. So the structure of short-term mission is, to go and tell in a mission field somewhere else, what you've seen in terms of your own, kind of relationship to the gospel and relationship to Jesus Christ. So you've already seen and you're going and telling. These tours are set up to come and see in a distant geographical location, the sort of Christ's witness in marginalized people, in this case, Palestinians, Palestinian Christians in particular, and then go and tell of it at home. So home becomes the mission field. And I think this is really compelling, particularly for progressive American Christians, for a few reasons. One is because liberation theology writ large is very influential in progressive American Christian churches. Again, it's sort of like how dispensationalism is influential in, certain segments of conservative evangelicalism. I don't know that your average sort of UCC member would be able to tell you, give you sort of a treatise on liberation theology, sure. But it just makes it into sermons and into the religious culture. Yeah. And so I think these tours then become compelling because they're sort of a materialization of the kinds of theological characteristics of liberation theology, like offering a preferential option for the poor, for instance, giving epistemological privilege to the marginalized other. I think also part of this, this influence of liberation theology is a decolonial impulse. I think that there are a lot of good critiques of short-term missions, and I think those have kind of made it into a lot of progressive mainline churches that,
and even progressive evangelical spaces, I would say,
and progressive evangelical spaces. I thank you for correcting me, because actually 2 of my tours were evangelical.
Okay.
And maybe particularly progressive evangelical spaces, because short-term missions is so
Sure.
it is such a big presence in the evangelical world. That, it's quite patronizing. It's quite colonial. It's quite presumptuous to think that we can go and paint a house for a week, or, go and play with some kids and, sort of change people's lives, when maybe some local folks could have been hired to paint that house, and we could have, supported the local economy. It's sort of a neo-colonial extension, right? And so these critiques, I think, have made it into both evangelical and mainline progressive spaces. And the inverse of short-term mission that the Come and See tours, kind of create, then makes sense in terms of those critiques. And I would hear that echoed in my research participants as to why this kind of tour. It's because I want to go somewhere to witness, and not witness as in tell, as witness as in first person. I want to go somewhere to witness marginalized people and learn from their experience, rather than do for. So I think that the influence of liberation theology, decoloniality has really played a part in it. I also think there are explicit calls in various American progressive religious spaces that have kind of given airtime to these kinds of tours. So, for instance, in Catholic spaces, Pope Francis's continued calls for a culture of encounter. In my own denomination, in the Episcopal Church, Michael Curry's Becoming a Beloved Community initiative, one of the pillars, is like justice and peace pilgrimages. You get that language quite a bit. And one of the trips that I studied was a Presbyterian Church USA trip that used a similar kind of language. They called it Mosaic of Peace, but it was a similar kind of language for the kinds of the kinds of goods that this trip might sort of give the denomination, and it was hosted by the denomination. So I think also people who are sort of members of particular denominations are seeing more and more calls by their own churches and denominations to take these kinds of trips. And these kinds of trips are being promoted more readily in these spaces. And so I think that's how a lot of people find themselves on them.
Yeah, that's really great. I think that it's really helpful to understand the structure that you're describing as an inverse of short-term missions, and even your use of the term witness, I think, does that really well. Not going to be a witness, but even just instead flipping that term around of witness as an action, so that it then might produce a telling that is actually back at home. I'm curious if you think, like, okay, so there's this shift in American denomination and even maybe regional church leaders of encouraging and platforming these kinds of tours to witness, perhaps even to build relationship with Palestinian Christian communities. I'm curious if you see this as heeding a call from Palestinian Christians. In our last episode, we talked with Michelle Awad, who's a Palestinian Christian, been in the tourism industry for a long time, a part of the Siraj Center. And he said, like, some of the most important work that, kind of the Christian tourism industry in Bethlehem has done is putting out these continued calls to Western church leaders to just come and see. I mean, really, that language is so fitting, and to build and establish relationship with Palestinian Christian communities. Does that feel like it's starting to translate? I don't know.
Well, I think that there's definitely sort of a meeting. So as these kinds of tours, and I, so to back up a little bit, I call the Palestinian Christian tours that I research Come and See tours, but I place them in a genre of tourism, of American religious travel, I should say, that I think is becoming more and more prominent. And I call that journeys to the margins. And I see analogous trips going to the US-Mexico border, going to South Africa, going to Rwanda, going to civil rights sites in the American South that have very similar logics of this kind of come and see, go and tell. So there's that happening, as I sort of just described in the US, that these kinds of journeys to the margins are becoming more and more present, more and more platformed, make theological sense in, kind of areas of Christianity that are influenced by liberation theologies. So that's happening. At the same time, then, as you say, Palestinian Christians, I mean, really for decades, but, it's just sort of ramped up, are calling American Christians to come and see, and creating opportunities for them to do so through, various organizations like Sabeel, like Mishu Rahab's DR Consortium, like Christ at the Checkpoint conferences that Bethlehem Bible College hosts. I mean, there are ones that are less explicitly religious through like Alternative Tourism Group. I mean, yeah, they're just really multiplying. And so I do think that there's this kind of synergy between what's happening in progressive Christianity in the US and then this call to come and see. And of course, come and see really originates, I want to say, in the Kairos document, which was, that language was used before the Kairos document, but the Kairos document really was the a really foundational call for American Christians that Palestinian Christians were expressing to our American Christian brothers and sisters. The primary thing you can do is to come and see and go and tell. And so I think as these trips have multiplied, as American Christians have become more aware of these kinds of trips, there are just more and more progressive Christians, by and large progressive Christians, going on them.
Yeah. Okay. And as a reminder for our listeners, we've talked about the Kairos Palestine document before, but this was first, I think, in 2009 when it was first put out.
2008 or 2009.
Yeah,
I think it was written in 2008, but I think technically it was put out in 2009.
Yeah. Okay. And modeled after this Kairos document that came out of South Africa during the anti-apartheid movement, again, calling in the global church into that movement against apartheid. So just wanted to mention that there too. I know that we're supposed to wrap up soon, but I have so many questions to ask you, Sara. But I think maybe I'll just ask one for now. So in you're explaining this movement that you're seeing just in like American travel, or maybe American Christian travel broadly, of centering the experiences of those who are marginalized. And what I hear in that is a decentering of the self in that kind of experience, that it's not necessarily either like a trip in terms of a vacation that's supposed to be for oneself or relaxation or enjoyment, or the other one that it's not supposed to, it kind of moves away from being a kind of spiritual or pilgrimage experience that's solely to benefit the self. And so I wonder if in this kind of trip, does that create a tension, or does it pull away from this pilgrimage model of like going to see and walk in the places where Jesus walked and in the places where his ministry was? Is there a tension there, or how does that get worked out when a sort of like personal spiritual experience, or maybe even like historical biblical one, is kind of moved away from, or maybe just decentered a little bit?
Yeah, that's a really, really good question, and one that I'm constantly sort of raising and asking, grappling with in my book project. So I interviewed 65 people who had gone on, one of these 6 tours, 6 to 18 months after they came back from their trip. And every single person, I asked them, do you consider yourself a pilgrim? Because there's this kind of common observation in the pilgrimage studies literature, particularly pilgrimage to Israel, Palestine, the Holy Land pilgrimage studies literature, that pilgrims are really offended if you think of them as tourists, which then kind of obscures all the material realities of their presence there, right? Because, I mean, what do you have in your visa? From the very moment you get in, you get a tourist visa, right? There are certain ways that you are a tourist, but it offends their sort of spiritual sensibilities too. So I found that in my participants too, but I was curious, did they want to be known as pilgrims? And what I found is that there were only a small percentage of my participants who really identified with a pilgrim language, even though one of my trips was the Pilgrims of Ibelline trip that is part of the Pilgrims of Ibelline, organization that is founded on Elia Shakor's work. So even the trip was called Pilgrims of, and there were, the majority of people on that trip were like, no, I don't really consider myself a pilgrim. And most of the time, the reasoning was that they, the seeing the holy sites was cool, and that was sort of a bonus, they were glad they got to do that. But that wasn't their primary reason for going. Their primary reason for going was to witness the kind of Christ-like, witness Christ-like exemplars in the Holy Land, and to kind of bring that back with them. For some, the pilgrimage language was even a little bit, maybe offensive is a strong word, but they were more adamant they didn't want to be called pilgrims, because it did feel like it cheapened that aspect of the trip for them, that they didn't want it to be about a personal spiritual journey. They wanted it to have more sort of solidarity resonances with it. And then for others, I think the pilgrimage language didn't land. And this was with many of my evangelical participants, because pilgrimage simply isn't in it's not prominent in the evangelical vocabulary. So I think for them, it was just a little baffling to even be asked that question. So there are different reasons why I think people didn't want to be called pilgrims, but I think that really kind of, but most of them didn't. And I think that really kind of demonstrates the difference in motivation between going on the kinds of come and see tours that I researched and your average Holy Land pilgrimage. It was not about, to use Hilary Cale's language, walking where Jesus walked, but it was really about walking how Jesus walked, right? That was sometimes the language that was used, or walking where Jesus is walking today. It was really centered on the witness of Christ-like exemplars. And again, this really shows the liberation theology roots of these tours, that if Christ is present in the marginalized people, then I want to go see Christ there. And Christ is present with, the Palestinian Christians who are being oppressed. And I want to, and to witness that is not just a personal spiritual transformation, but it is to be shared when I get back home. So yeah.
Yeah, that's so helpful to know, like those reframes that are being used, that really, it brings it back to liberation theology of how it's rooted there. And I'm reminded of how a lot of Palestinian Christian communities will refer to themselves as the living stones, as opposed to just the ancient stones that many tours focus on. And that strikes me as well, of sort of kind of being woven into this kind of orientation to want to walk where Jesus would walk today, or see exemplars of like kind of, where Christ would be embodied if we look at the land today, in living stones, maybe.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's where the living stones kind of moniker emerges from. I have a really complex relationship with the term living stones. And it really goes back to that observation, Gyatur Spivak's Can the Subaltern Speak, is that I think that living stones really works to get across that liberation theology kind of narrative, but it also is, a stone is not a person, a stone is an object. And so it's kind of a objectification strategy, because Palestinian Christians know that American Christians are most interested in their homeland because it is a holy place in Christianity. And so in order to make themselves compelling to Western Christian audiences who are typically compelled to go to the land because of ancient stones, Palestinian Christians then need to make themselves into stones themselves rather than being who they are in all their complexity. And so I don't say that as a critique of Palestinian Christians and what, subaltern people need to do in order to be able to communicate their story to, those of us who, are privileged. I say that as a critique to my own, kind of broader progressive Christian American community, because we are the ones who are creating the market for that kind of language, right? Like we are the ones who are demanding that Palestinian Christians make themselves into an object in order to get our attention.
It's a really helpful place to maybe end. I don't know. I hear your words as almost like a call or a question, maybe to those of us, right, who are part of these spaces, who are listening, of what are the ways in which, our own kind of demands of the kinds of stories and histories we're interested in shape actually what it is that we hear from Palestinian Christians, and how can we better allow for them to shape what it is that we need to hear and how we should be engaging and traveling to the land if we do.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. And that's really how my, book project ends, is a call for what does it mean? What does it mean to shift our own sort of our own kind of demands, our own expectations, to really engage in deep reflexivity. And I think true solidarity, if we want to be in solidarity with Palestinian Christians and more broadly with Journeys to the Margins, we really want to be in solidarity with marginalized people. And I say we as in, white progressive American Christians who, of which I consider myself a part, a group of which I consider myself a part, then we really need to take a deep look at ourselves and, kind of the structures that we are setting up that then set the terms for how marginalized persons can speak to us.
Well, Sara Williams, it has been a true pleasure to talk to you. Thank you for all that you've shared with us. I know you're going to stick around and we'll have a bit of an extended conversation for our listeners and supporters on Patreon. But for now, thanks for an incredible conversation.
Thanks so much for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
This episode is supported by Peace Catalyst International. Across the Divide has joined forces with Peace Catalyst International to amplify the pursuit of peace and to explore the vital intersection of Christian faith and social justice in Palestine, Israel. Both Peace Catalyst and Across the Divide are committed to equipping Christians worldwide to move beyond apathy and into active solidarity, working together for a holistic and just peace for everyone in the land. By supporting this partnership, you can help elevate Palestinian voices and initiatives working for peace all over the world. Visit Peace Catalyst International's website to learn more about their work and consider giving to them directly or supporting us through our page on the Peace Catalyst website. The link is available in the show notes below. Together, we can equip Christians to begin following Jesus in his sacred and healing work for a just peace.
Thanks for tuning in to this episode of Across the Divide. We are so grateful for your support and interest. The hosts of this podcast are Daniel Bannoura, Jennifer Madrand, and myself, Abir Shhali. Salim Anfous is our producer. Our theme music is composed by Charlie Rishmawi. To help sustain the work of this podcast, please consider becoming a financial supporter of Across the Divide. Any donation amount makes a difference, and with a donation of as little as $5 a month, you will gain access to exclusive supporter-only content. Go to patreon.com/acrossthedivide to learn more and donate. For any feedback or suggestions, connect with us on Instagram at Across the Divide Podcast. Until next time, stay curious, stay passionate, stay engaged, and join us again on Across the Divide.